Hello and welcome to today's Range 4 webcast brought to you with DevOps Guys. My name's Helen Beale. I'm the head of DevOps here at Ranger 4, and I'll pass over to Steve in just a moment, who's going to be delivering the presentation today. Just a couple of things before we start though. You are all on mute at the moment. We will have a question and answer session at the end. I can unmute you, or if you'd like to send me your questions either using the questions feature in GoToWebinar or the chat feature, please do. This session is also being recorded, so you will receive a link to the recording tomorrow or early next week, and we will also make the slides that Steve's going through today available to you as well. So Steve, over to you.
Okay, thanks Helen. Good afternoon everybody. My name is Stephen Thayer. I'm one of the co-founders of DevOpsGuys. We're a company specializing in DevOps, continuous integration, and most importantly, managed operations. So the purpose of this webinar today is really just to talk about some of the mind shifts that we see going on in the market, and really the topic is try and get people to move away from being focused on managing servers. And as operations people, my background is as an operations manager for companies like Total Jobs, and we rebuilt the RSE, various other sort of websites like that. So I've been doing infrastructure and operations for 20 years. And really this is also just partly talking about my mind shift over the last few years as I've moved along this journey to stop thinking about service. So let's just take a quick look at the agenda. So we're going to talk about some of the forces that are acting on the IT departments and operations. We're going to talk a little bit about DevOps as a response to those, and what DevOps really is, with a little slight segue into systems thinking, and then just talk about some specific ways to be application-centric, and I'll run through a couple of case studies as well, just depending upon the time we have to show. Focusing on a server level can sometimes be a bad mistake. So what's happening to our businesses and our organizations? You know, modern companies, you know, are very interested in time to market. They're interested in higher frequencies of release. I'd actually argue that this slide that Nick Bartolomeus put together shows a more heterogeneous environment in traditional enterprise. I would actually argue that there's even more traditional heterogeneous environment in a modern organization. It's just sort of being glued together in different ways. I would strongly agree with that. We're trying to move away from top-down command and control models, and we're trying to work out from a practitioner bottom-up process view. So, and very strongly agree with the last point at the bottom there, built with automation in mind. So one of the other big factors is this idea of shadow IT. Some great quotes that you'll see on the slide, you know, sort of indicating that the expenditure, you know, the amount of control that falls under the CIO's budget is moving away from IT. And increasingly also indicating that at the top performers, that shift might actually be even better, even more so. So IT controls less than 50% of the corporate technology expenditure. And the reason for this is simple, is that it is far easier now for somebody in the marketing department with a credit card to go out to a cloud provider or a SaaS provider and fire up an application. They can also go out to a development house and a development company and just build an environment and an application stack completely outside of the control of IT. So there's a question there for the IT department is that, you know, how do we remain relevant, and how do we deal with this kind of sprawl that's outside of our budget and outside of our control? Obviously, over the last sort of 15 years or so, development has changed enormously. For most of the sort of young developers that I work with, particularly in startups, you know, for them, Agile, Scrum, XP, that style of development, that is development to them. The idea of the old sort of waterfall model of having a massive specification document and moving through rigid phases with gated checkpoints, they don't know what we're talking about. So, you know, as a result of, you know, of the process that you see here from Agile, it's continuous integration, continuous delivery, and then sort of ideally ultimately ending in DevOps. It's brought a very iterative mindset to the thing. It's brought higher rates of change. It's put a lot more pressure on operations to keep up with development. So in effect, development have moved the bottleneck that used to be in their ability to ship code, test code, to move code through the environment, and a lot of that pressure is now firmly shifted down into the operations. Obviously, technology is keeping evolving. What you actually see here is a tag cloud generated from job ads from CW Jobs website, and some of the things which are on this tag cloud, didn't exist a few years ago. Amazon, Azure, AWS, Chef, Puppet. A lot of these things are brand new, so now they bring along a whole new challenges. NoSQL databases like MongoDB, again, huge explosion in NoSQL. Again, back when I started, there was only one kind of database, and it was relational. And that's what everybody used, whether it was necessarily appropriate or not. So technology is keeping evolving. We as operations people have to stay on top of that. So if we sort of summarize a lot of these forces together, we've got changes from the business and time to market. We're under pressure from agile continuous delivery. We've got cloud environments coming in. We've got SaaS providers, offering products that we need to either integrate with, or that the SaaS products are a replacement for what was traditionally done on premise. So we've got to come up with different ways of dealing and managing with that sort of stuff. We've got infrastructure as code, Puppet, Chef, software-defined networking coming in from the side as a follow-on from infrastructure as code. We've got APM tools like AppDynamics, which are giving us unprecedented visibility into the application stack. And we've also got pressures like things like bring your own device, and just many more things that are happening. So to come up with an analogy for how I see servers in a modern world, the best analogy that I could come up with was that servers are like razors. Back in the old days, we had the your cutthroat razor. And these were often works of art. They had, as you can see in the picture, they had pearl inlays, they had engravings. They were expensive, so in effect they had a high capex. They had a long lifetime, but they had a high maintenance cost. They needed to be oiled, they needed to be sharpened, they needed to be stropped regularly. And you or your butler, if you were in Downton Abbey, were able to take care of these kind of things, and they were in some cases heirlooms that could be passed down from generation to generation. And certainly when I started and I was sort of racking and stacking servers in data centers, they were like gold. There was a very long cycle to get the capex approved to buy a server. They were expected to be amortized over a long period, and there was certainly maintenance costs and failure rates associated with them. But so you nursed them and took care of them. But now the world's moved on, and modern servers are much more like disposable razors that we probably use every day. So as we know, disposable razors have a high OPEX. You have to keep buying these razor blades. They're very expensive. They'll give you away the handle, but you have to pay for the blades. They're ephemeral. They don't last very long. We tend to throw them away. We turn them over. And in many cases, particularly if you've got modern infrastructure as code tools, it's far easier to just reboot a new server, to spin up a new server to replace. And in many cases, that affects the way that we do our things like our deployment strategies, rollout strategies. We can have A/B server farms that we flip between. You just spin up an entire new farm when you're doing a new release, drain any activity on the old farm, and let the new servers take the load. So I think it's just trying to emphasise the point that that modern servers are just something that comes and goes. So if our attention and focus isn't shifting from this transient ephemeral layer of servers, then we're putting our attention in the wrong place. So what's DevOps and why is DevOps coming around? So DevOps was coined a couple of years ago. There was a sort of core group of people, Patrick Dubois, Gene Kim, we'll talk about some of the other people, John Willis. So they sort of were looking at all of these forces that we've just discussed, the why of DevOps, and trying to sort of work out, what was a better way. So they did a lot of study. They looked at the high performers in the industry, and they, came up with some great stats about, their mean time to recover, about their deployment rates, their change failure rates, and they sort of saw that it was a real, outlier, that the top performers were working in a different way, and then they tried to research what that different way was, and then bring that message back into the broader community. So if we take Gene's definition of what DevOps is, the key element there is this collaborative working relationship between development and operations, resulting in the fast flow of planned work. So that's the crucial nub of the DevOps message. It's about shipping things faster because you've broken down the silos between development and operations. He goes on also to say that simultaneously increasing the reliability, stability, resilience, and security of the production environment, which sounds a lot like the panacea. DevOps is going to fix everything. But there's good reasons as to why those sort of things are true. If you can rapidly deploy change, if you focus on small change, that is going to improve the stability of your environment. If you can put a change out, that change is going to succeed 99.9% of the time because you've automated the process. That if it fails, you can get it back out quickly. That it's only a small change. You've got change constantly flowing through the environment, so you get very, very good at change. All of these things, do directly lead to having improved reliability, stability, resilience, and security. So, in terms of the influences that are on DevOps, a lot of the stuff, really has come from the manufacturing viewpoint originally. The work of Deming, the work of G.G. Ono in the Toyota production system, these concepts of waste and lean, particularly the lean Eric Ries and the lean startup movement. Goldratt's top there stands for theory of constraints. So that's this idea of focusing on trying to identify the constraints in your environment. There's a great quote that says that any improvement that is not at the point of constraint is just an illusion. So there's no point in improving things upstream because you just increase the queue at the point of constraint, and there's no point in improving the efficiency downstream because you'll just starve. Downstream is even more starved of work. So you've got to do this iterative process, and that's what the theory of constraints is really all about. So a bit of a philosophical background there related to the DevOps movement, and you can research those yourself. As part of this DevOps movement, they've come up with a model. You'll either see it as the CAMS model, C-A-M-S, or the CALMS model, if you put the addition of lean. But these are the elements that you need to focus on if you're going to do a DevOps transformation. Culture, obviously bringing people together, getting that collaboration, getting a culture that embraces change, is willing to sustain high rates of change, and being able to demonstrate to your management why high rates of change are suitable. Automation, so again, continuous integration, so TeamCity builds, automated builds, the use of test-driven development, behavior-driven development, all the sort of automated test suite tools that can be triggered by TeamCity, Maven, Jenkins, whatever, Hudson, whatever you're sort of using for those sort of continuous integration, continuous delivery workflow. Swinging into infrastructure as code, Puppet, Chef, Ansible, all of these kind of names. Lean, more coming back to the philosophical point of view, very much focused on value, very much focused on flow, small batch sizes, getting things to flow smoothly through the system, reducing the time it takes from what the Pop NDX called from concept to cache. So from the initial concept where your business has an idea of something that's going to have value to the customers, it's going to make them money, to getting that out into the production environment where it's generating cash for your business. How can you reduce that total cycle time? Metrics, huge explosion in the kind of metrics that we can measure. Obviously, if you've ever seen any of your presentations from Etsy, they're very big fans of StatsD, Graphite, tools like this, which enable you to collect an enormous amount of metrics and to graph them, start to look for statistical correlation. We can talk a little bit more about what kind of metrics you should be looking at later. And then this open and collaborative environment, we tend to use tools like Confluence, collaborative wikis, so that you can see the history of how the project has evolved and how what you're delivering is evolved, and all of this, documentation, rather than being seen as something which is done at the end and then is handed over. Here's a big dump of documentation in Word documents that gets handed over to operations. That the operations people and the development people are collaboratively building and exchanging this information all throughout the software development lifecycle. So by the time it actually comes to be moving into the production environment, you've got a great resource of troubleshooting information, about how the environment is built and configured. So let's talk a bit about the 3 ways of DevOps and systems thinking. So the 3 ways of DevOps was, again, promoted by Gene Kim and the guys at IT Revolution Press. Really just trying to give 3 core principles on how you should approach a DevOps transformation. And the first one, which I've highlighted here, is systems thinking. The goal is to think about the entire system and to focus on the end value. And what's interesting in this model, as you can sort of see, is that the customer is kind of over at the operation side of things, and in many ways, it's interesting that operations can be seen traditionally is seen as a supplier to the development team or a supplier to the business, and it's interesting to sort of think about as operations being yet another customer of the development process. We have operational requirements, or non-functional requirements, as some people like to call them, that we need to have in place in order to make this system work for the customers. As operations, you could argue that we're closer to the customers and closer to the real end user experience than what's happening in development. So the whole goal here in systems thinking is to think about, never pass a defect downstream along the workflow, never allow the local optimization, those points of constraint, to create global degradation. Always looking to increase flow and always seeking to achieve a profound understanding of the system as promoted by Deming. So the second way is about taking this flow of work and information in a collaborative environment between development and operations, and making sure that you've put this this idea of feedback loops. For those of you that are familiar with the ITIL sort of view of the world, this is nothing new. Feedback loops is exactly the same as continuous service improvement inside the ITIL. But I think the mindset shift here in the DevOps world is that CSI is a key enabler of DevOps. And in many ITIL shops, you often find that continuous service improvement is, you do your incident process, and you do your problem process, and you do your change process, and you do your release process. And by the time you've done all this, you're a bit tired of doing processes, and often CSI sort of falls away to the wayside. People never really implement that feedback loop. And DevOps is saying that feedback loop, forefront, right up front, absolutely critical. If you're not measuring the important things, and if those measurements that you're taking don't enable you to go back and change the system, then A, you're measuring the wrong thing, and B, you're never going to get better. So the third way of DevOps is about this idea of a culture of continuous experimentation and learning. So it's about taking this idea of the feedback loops and saying, how can we iterate faster? If it takes us 3 months to make a change, learn from it, and feed it back, then we're only going to really do four sets of cycles of improvement or something throughout the year. But if we can get that cycle time down to a week or a day, that we can make a change, test it with our customers, get that feedback, refine it, and understand what works and doesn't work, we will get this this learning. So it's all about embracing change and being willing to experiment. And that's a really big shift, and probably the biggest shift to communicate to the business, because a lot of businesses are afraid of change. They're afraid of change because historically, operations and development, because of a dysfunctional relationship, haven't been very good at it. We haven't been able to deploy change out without breaking stuff. So either the code doesn't work properly because it hasn't been tested properly, or we don't have the right release notes, and we're stuck in a manual mode of change, and we can't roll out a change consistently across a wide environment. We can't synchronize the activities across the environment. So every time we change something, break something. So the business is afraid of change. They keep saying, let's do bigger and bigger change, let's do less change and batch them up into bigger and bigger changes, which is the exact opposite of the message of DevOps. If I'm doing quarterly releases and I've got 3 months worth of development work and changes being lumped into one build, and I've got a development team of 20 guys, so I've got the output of 20 guys times 3, so 60 man days worth of work or something, or man months worth of work, being lumped together into one change. As from an operations point of view, if it doesn't work, the job that I have of unpicking that and trying to work out what went wrong is enormous, and that's why it takes me a long time to debug the problem. That's why it takes me a long time to back it out. But obviously, if you've got this culture of continual experimentation and learning, I'm putting small changes, continuous flow by my continuous integration and continuous delivery workflow. It's been tested. I know it's high quality because I've built that pipeline to make sure that it's high quality. I've got automated release management, ARA tools, application release automation. I know that I can deploy it quickly. I know that I can pull it back quickly. I'm using feature flags to be able to toggle things on and off. Suddenly, yeah, let's do a change every day. Let's do multiple changes a day. Let's do like Amazon did prior to Christmas 2012, where I think they peaked at 1,700 production changes per day. Just for many organizations, that's an insane rate of change. But if each one of those represents a really small change, and if I can very quickly isolate which was the change that made the faults, and I've got all the tracking and all the metrics and the monitoring in place, it's very quickly for me to roll back. Why wouldn't I push change through the environment and be willing to experiment? And the willingness to experiment, can have big impacts on your business and your business success, because you can bring products to market quicker, and you can learn from your mistakes as well. That's what it's all about. So systems thinking is this sort of wider, mindset that is one of the philosophical forebears to DevOps. And the key message of systems thinking is it's about interrelationships rather than things. I'm looking at the entire application. I'm looking at the entire ecosystem. I'm not just looking at a web server, an application server, a database server. And if we look at the Open University's definition, it's about learning. So again, we can see the direct correlation here to the learning things we were talking about in the third way of DevOps earlier. And we're looking at the connected whole. So again, the first way of DevOps. Helen quite likes the phrase practical holism. So, it's not being holistic in any sort of airy-fairy sense of the word. It's about being holistic in a very practical and a very pragmatic sense of the word, because it enables you to do things. And this has a knock-on effect to the way that you see the world. A command and control methodology, I hesitate to say, a Prince2 type view of the world, but it's very much top-down, it's hierarchical, it's outside. So as opposed to systems thinking, which is looking at the outside in versus inside out, the work is about is designed in a way that promotes flow through the system, theory of constraints talks about things like drum, buffer, and rope. If you want to Google those, talking about how you pull demand through the system, how you use queuing and appropriate things to smooth out the flow, and how you make sure that you have a nice steady cadence of work. Decision making is delegated. Attitude towards suppliers, and attitude, I would argue, internally as well. Whether you see, the relationship between development and operations, if we're seen as a supplier and we have to put contractual style relationships and SLAs in place, and really, huge documents that everybody has to sit around a table and sign off before we can move up into production, as opposed to a cooperative where we've all got responsibility for it. We're all, passionate about making sure that this change and this new product, this new application succeeds, and we do that in a cooperative way. And yeah, there was an assumptions there about motivation. If any of you have a sort of a HR background, they'll talk about, McGregor's type X and type Y managers. Type X manager assumes that everybody only works, for money. They're all motivated by fear, and all of their motivations are extrinsic. A type Y manager assumes that motivation is intrinsic. People want to do a good job. They're professional. They care about their, the delivery. They care about the company. They care about the people that they work with. So again, it's about where are you falling on that spectrum of assuming about motivation. So how do we apply some of this sort of practical systems thinking, this practical holism, in a DevOps world? And we've sort of called it becoming application-centric, because we want to raise that focus up to the application level. So we had this diagram before, which is really just showing the software development lifecycle. So the first thing is that if you're an operations person, you're down there in that little deploy and operate box, and sort of see there is actually a little slight grey line down there. You've got to understand the software development lifecycle. You've got to understand what's happening. You've got to have these feedback loops in place to get that information back. You should be working collaboratively, to build the continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline. You should be building using infrastructure as code tools to build the environment as part of the software development process. That infrastructure as code should be checked into the source control, and it should be moving through the environment in the same way that the code is. Every time you do a deployment, let's rebuild the environment. We've got the tools to do it if we're working in a flexible cloud or virtualized environment. So, you've got to stop thinking just about your little silo at the end. You've got to understand the whole life cycle. Key quote from Jez Humble, also one of the major proponents of DevOps, is that we have to move away from this project-centric view of the world. We've got to think about we're managing software products from inception through to retirement. And that's a challenge for both development and operations. Your development's responsibility doesn't stop just when the project is ended. It never stops until that piece of application or system or change is retired out and is no longer functioning in any production environment. So you've got to think about not just the software development lifecycle, but the entire product delivery lifecycle. And I think, if anybody that sort of works in a project might think there are many, many times when projects are declared success because they've met the project requirements or the modified, change and adapted project requirements, yet they haven't been successful in delivering a quality product. So again, holism states let's think about products, not projects. Organizational change, is about breaking down the silos. We have to sort of embrace this rapid flow of work. We have to embrace this collaboration between not just operations and development, but operations development and business sponsors, product owners, everybody out there, and obviously trying to reach out and as much as possible get a customer perspective so you can get customer feedback, and let's feedback the customer's requirements and the customer's views into things. But that requires organizational change. And organizational change, DevOps won't happen just by implementing tools. DevOps has to happen by organizational change, and that requires you to get out there and talk to your HR people and make things happen. You've got to understand the dependencies. Again, this is a screenshot from an APM tool called AppDynamics, and it's sort of showing that modern applications can have dependencies on multiple databases. These represent services and applications, not representing servers. So this is showing that for a given transaction that flows through this system, it touches web services, multiple application servers, multiple databases, and from an operations point of view, this viewpoint of the world of looking at it from the application perspective, and we're able to understand all of the dependencies, which are often not very well documented in the code. I'm going off and I'm talking to a third-party web service, I'm talking to Postcode Anywhere, I'm talking to a payment gateway, I'm talking to Google Maps, I'm talking to Facebook. Some of these dependencies are very, very difficult for operations to see because they're embedded in a line in a configuration file. If we can see and visualize these dependencies in a clear way, that's a huge win for us. I mentioned this quote before. It's about finding your constraints. Very important from a DevOps view is because we understand the systems view, we understand the dependencies, we can then try and find where exactly is the constraint and focus on alleviating that constraint, which might move that constraint somewhere else in the system. It might move that constraint down, but again, we're in an iterative cycle with high rates of change. We're going to go through and we're going to go back through the system, look at the impacts, find the next point of constraint, knock it down, find the next point of constraint, knock it down, go back, all the time, keeping that first view is, don't seek local optimizations at the cost of global degradation. We need to look at how we're measuring what activity that's happening in our system. So there's a huge impact on the metrics, learning, and change. So systems thinking talks very clearly about two types of measures. Arbitrary measures, which are the command and control viewpoints. It's the inside-out view, and they're both generally focused on outputs versus capability measures, which are focused on purpose. What do we actually do? And I mean, the classic example here was they often talk about about call centers. People in call centers are incentivized to have high call rates and to in many cases, get the calls through, not let the person think. So you get that kind of behavior where, somebody picks up the phone and then hangs it up because they didn't want the person, they wanted to answer it within the 30-second goal, but then, oh no, the customer hung up. If the metric that you're measuring does not tell you something about the system in this holistic view, if that metric cannot point you back to some constraint or part of the process and the system that you're working in, the processes and procedures, and tell you how to improve that, why are you measuring it? Because sometimes you're measuring it just to have something to report up to management. And there's a great quote from the father of this, Deming, who we talked about earlier. Any numerical goal can be achieved because we can redefine the terms, we can fake it, and we can throw money at it. A classic example of this in an operations world is, most operations managers are probably incentivized on availability. You must achieve 99.9% availability per quarter, and say maybe it might be as vague as that. So you kind of go, well, what does availability mean? Does that mean everything is there? Does it mean I need to be able to find a product? Does it mean the website is up? Does it mean I can actually check out? Does it mean I can do an end-to-end user journey that's representative of what the customer? So I can change that term. I can talk about things like how else can I fake it? I can redefine, unscheduled downtime as scheduled downtime, for example. So that we're going to do a change. That outage doesn't really count because that was related to a change, and that's not counted in our availability things. And I might, in order to protect my bonus, I might say, well, in order to increase availability, I've got to deploy 10 more servers. There might be better ways of dealing it. If I was looking at the system as a whole, I might be able to go back and look at many other ways of achieving that availability. But if I want to meet my bonus and my availability target, it's quicker for me to just run up costs. So again, there's got to look at the metrics that you're looking and make sure that they're incentivized learning and improvement, not just incentivized hitting the target for the sake of hitting the target. So let's sort of give a practical example here. One metric that a lot of people look at, you know, when you're reporting up things is transactions a second. You know, how many transactions a second is my environment is doing, and more transactions a second is better. And if I'm, you know, if I'm doing a load test and I'm reporting information up, or, you know, to my thing, I want to sort of show, oh, you know, we were doing, you know, 1,000 transactions a second last month, and we're doing 2,000 transactions a second this month. Isn't that great? So, you know, again, screenshot from AppDynamics showing the transaction rates. So I'm doing 4,000 calls a minute, business transactions in this particular case, you know, and I'm averaging, you know, two milliseconds is the average response time in talking to the database. So, you know, that's fantastic. I'm doing 4,000 database calls a minute, and I'm doing them, it's averaging it's 2,000, you know, but it's a pretty arbitrary measure. The focus is on the metric and these higher transaction rates. So let's sort of, you know, zoom out. Let's take the systems thinking approach and actually look at a particular transaction. So this is a particular transaction to authenticate a user in a single sign-on platform. So overall, this thing's actually taking 781 milliseconds, which is extremely slow for a back-end process in an online web environment. The cascading effect of that to an actual customer user experience would be, you know, enormous. But hang on, you know, in my previous slide, I was doing 4,000 calls a minute, and each one was only, you know, on average, they were only taking 2 milliseconds. You know, how did we get there? Well, I can look down here and I can see that the time I'm taking to talk to the database in ADO.NET, it's like 570% of the time is communication to the database. ADO.NET being the method library. So if I drill down into the SQL again, you know, I've zoomed out to the systems view to get a bigger perspective, and now I'm starting to drill back down, and I can sort of see over here that I've got multiple queries, select queries being performed, and I seem to be doing all of these select queries about 64 times, 64, 70, 74. So as a capability measure, what does this high transaction rate tell me about the system? Well, it tells me I'm doing 262 calls in order to just authenticate one user. So what it really tells me is I've got really inefficient SQL. I've probably used an object relationship mapper. I'm inside a loop that's iterating 64 times. I'm calling multiple select statements. You know, this is not an efficient way. So I've gone from what was a high transaction rate that I was thinking was a good measure that I could report up to my boss that I'm doing this great way and I've got my infrastructure, and actually we drill down. If we take a systems thinking viewpoint, we take a step back, we look at the big picture, we find the constraint, we drill down into the constraint, and we find the learning outcome, the capability measure that enables us to learn. The actual learning is we've got some really poor SQL in here that needs to be refactored, and we can move this to stored procedures, and we can check the where clauses, and we can understand why is it iterating through 64 things in order to do one person. You know, maybe we can look at that. Maybe we need some, you know, reindexes to make it faster, etc., etc. So that's sort of one practical example. So pretty much to summarize, I'm conscious of time, and we want to leave some time for Q&A. Sort of to summarize, thinking the systems thinking viewpoint, understand, take the outside in view, always be thinking about this, zooming back out. How can I understand the entire thing? And zoom right back out to the customer needs and to the business goals. If you don't understand, you know, how your business makes money, particularly if you're in an online environment, your business makes money online, you know, how can you make optimal decisions for your organization? You've got to understand the product life cycle. You've got to understand the product lifecycle, not just from the software development lifecycle, but you've got to understand the product lifecycle from inception through to retirement. How did this how does this product, how am I going to manage this product? Am I going to set a sunset clause on this product? How am I going to roll this product out of if it doesn't, after it's run its course? Or how am I going to make sure that I'm not just accumulating this massive technical debt of all of these products out there that aren't really being used anymore? I've got to understand my dependencies. By understanding the dependencies, I can identify the constraints. I've got to make sure that the metrics that I'm looking at are capability metrics that are focused on learning, and I need to sort of embrace change and make sure that I'm using the second and third way of DevOps to put these continuous improvement feedback loops in place, and ideally reduce the cycle time so I can iterate faster and learn faster. So that's basically it from me. Thank you. Helen, are you?
I'm here, yes. We do have a couple of questions for you.
Got some? Great.
The first one is,
fire away.
There's lots of things to consider. Where do I start?
Ooh, okay. Lots of things to consider. Where would I start?
I've got a recommendation.
Sorry?
I potentially have an answer to that.
Yeah, let's go with your answer.
Well, I was going to say that our approach is to start with the DevOps maturity assessment. So we start by baselining where an organization is. So much like you were just talking about all the metrics that you have there, we use the metrics, the cultural metrics, and also some harder metrics around things like number of defects, volume and frequency of release, MTTR, things like that. So then we have a baseline position, and then we can start looking at where a customer might want to go, what their visualized future state might be, and start putting a roadmap together. And that doesn't kind of give us we start with this person or we start with this tool, but that's kind of a generic view of our approach.
Yeah, I think the approach of starting with starting with measurement is absolutely crucial. And I'd be putting here, think about your metrics and trying to look for capability metrics, not output and command and control metrics. Because obviously you are going to have to sell this change to the business, and obviously as part of any change project, you're going to look for quick wins, because quick wins give you momentum. And in order to generate quick wins, you've got to be able to demonstrate that you've had a positive impact on the business. So, and that's why, again, you've got to understand these business goals. So it's crucial to pick the right metric. I think that there is quite a debate around whether you sort of start with tools or start with other things. Some people would say that a tools-led approach would never work. Some people would say that sometimes you need to put tools in place just to get this visibility of what's going on. But I definitely think, even if you just start with having a pizza afternoon or a pizza evening with the developers and the operations guy in one place, let's start thinking about culture, and let's start thinking about the collaboration. So you can start the culture work stream tomorrow by just going out there and talking to the right people in your business. So I think that's probably a good place to start.
Yeah. And the next question is kind of similar, actually, or links. I think we've half answered it perhaps already. What does a DevOps project actually look like? And it's interesting what you were just saying, because with many years, while working with the application lifecycle management tools, I've been talking people process tools as the order of approach. And more recently, I'm starting to change that to culture, interactions, automation. And I think what you were just saying is that a project normally will have some kind of cultural change program that starts it off potentially with some tooling like App Dynamics to help identify initial bottlenecks or constraints, and then
I think if we eventually get back to the right slide, I think understanding. So to answer the question, what's a DevOps project going to look like, or a DevOps program going to look like as a whole? It's going to look like this, in the sense of you are going to be undertaking activities in each one of those areas. You are going to be going out there and trying to evangelize to the business and to operations and to development, you know, why we should be working in a collaborative way, why we should be moving to a product focus and not a project focus. You might be going out there and shooting a lot of people in your project management office. I don't know, probably not a recommended approach, but you know, there is going to be a cultural change, and that's going to have an impact on the way you're incentivized. It's going to have an impact on the way you hire. It's going to have an impact on, you know, the way, you know, your bonus plans and all that sort of stuff, and the way that work flows through your organization. You know, automation, you know, DevOps is heavily involved in automation. So continuous integration, you know, getting a build server, getting a test-driven or behavior-driven development approach with a strong, robust, you know, test framework underneath it. Looking at tools like, you know, Puppet Chef and Ansible for managing the environment. If you're in a .NET world, PowerShell, DSC, desired state configuration design. Yeah, I think it is. So there's lots of stuff that you can do in there. You know, evangelizing lean within the organization, particularly that small batch size. Getting the right tools in place to do the measurements, whether that's, you know, open source tools like StatsD and Graphite, whether that's commercial or even, you know, Nagios and Sensu, or whether it's commercial tools like AppDynamics that do give you the sort of more application level view of the world. And then, you know, then related to the culture is, you know, using tools like Confluence and any of those other wiki tools. We use HipChat. You know, everybody's constantly on HipChat. Other people use, you know, Jabber and things like that to have free and informal communication. We use Skype a lot as well. So yeah, so I mean, a project will touch on all of these things. The order that you address them would be probably specific to your business, but I think that you would need to have all of those strands in your overall project.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. And that brings us to the end of our question and answer session, and so the end of the webcast today. So thank you everybody for attending. Thank you in particular to Steve for doing all the content today. And as I said at the start, we will be sending the slides out to you by SlideShare and the recording of this webinar as well. So thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody else, and goodbye.
Goodbye.